Idaho has just gone through its very first ever all mail-in, all absentee ballot election. And this was absolutely unexpected and unprecedented. It's something that has been proposed for many years in our state legislature, but there's been strong resistance to. But this time around, our Republican Secretary of State, Lawrence Denny, actually proposed delaying the election because of the pandemic. We were in lockdown at that point. There was a statewide stay-at-home order. And instead of delaying the election, the governor chose to make it an all mail-in absentee ballot election. And I understand that that was in part because there were some people who were threatening to sue if the election were delayed, as has occurred in some other states, because Idaho law didn't actually allow for the election to be delayed, but it could go all mail, and it did. And so a lot of people thought it would be very low turnout. Idaho has no experience with voting by mail. How interested are people anyway at this time when there are so many, other things going on with the pandemic? And surprisingly, it was a record turnout. 429,000 Idahoans requested absentee ballots. Practically 400,000 of them ended up mailing them in and voting. It was the highest number who have ever voted in an Idaho primary election. It was not the highest percentage of registered voters, but it was the highest since 1980. So basically, Idaho came out and embraced this. There still, however, is not much political support for going to an all mail-in voting system in Idaho, even though our neighbors Oregon and Washington have been doing that for years successfully and have found that it increased turnout. So I, at this point, do not expect Idaho to adopt this on a permanent basis, but we're hearing a lot of rumblings from around the state from people who really liked it, particularly senior citizens, and would like to see it. That's what I've seen. In fact, the risk of voter fraud has been the #1 objection to mail-in voting in Idaho for years and years and years. And I just actually got off the phone a little while ago with our Secretary of State, Lawrence Denny, who I was interviewing for my Sunday column, because he was one of the major opponents of mail-in voting. And he always, when he was the Speaker of the House, when he was in the legislature, cited the risk of fraud. And he said he's kind of changed his mind now that he's on the other side. He doesn't see much risk of fraud at all. That in fact, in Idaho, our absentee ballot system, which involves the voter having to actively request an absentee ballot, fill it out and sign it, and then that signature being compared to their signature in their voter registration, is very resistant to fraud. And we have seen almost no voter fraud in Idaho. So he said, he doesn't really have that concern so much anymore. On the other hand, he still doesn't support moving to all mail-in voting because he thinks that we have a lot of traditional people in Idaho who are accustomed to going to the polls, and we should continue to afford them that opportunity. I would relate this even to my own experience. Since the pandemic began, there are a lot more people, a lot more older people who are spending more time on one or more devices. Whereas previously that was something that was more common just among the younger demographic. And so there are a lot of older people using Zoom. I think there are more older people on social media. And that's really where the threat of the misinformation and the disinformation is. And there is a ton of disinformation out there, as we all know. You can find anything on social media. I think a good example is one of our local TV stations, KTVB, has a kind of a regular feature called Verify. And say last year during the campaign, they used that to verify claims that candidates made in their campaign ads. Well, lately, Verify has been about what's the latest crazy rumor on social media, and we can verify there's absolutely no truth to it. And it seems like they come up with something crazier every week. And there's stuff out there, it's kind of hard to believe anyone would believe it, but particularly I think for some people who don't have much experience with the internet, don't have much experience with social media, there is that danger. I did think of one other point. So Todd mentioned the timing of our election. We stuck with our May 19th election day, but we made that the deadline to request an absentee ballot. And then there were 2 weeks after that to get the completed ballot in by June 2nd. And one thing that we also did differently from particularly what Washington does is that June 2nd was not a postmark deadline. It was the date by which the county clerks had to have the completed ballot in their hands, and it could be dropped off in person by 8 p.m. And I have to say, as a reporter, I love that because I used to work for the Spokesman Review, which is on the state line between Idaho and Washington. And my colleagues in the state of Washington, when election night would roll around, they would have no idea that night who had won. And not only that, they would have no idea when they would know, because it could take weeks for all the ballots to come rolling in the mail. And that seemed to me a real downside to mail-in voting, but we did not have that issue here in Idaho because we had a firm deadline at which the ballots had to be in hand.